I wanted to like sort of lead into now like the really good part, which you're known for, which is chastising and berating Ethereum. But I wanted to start this off by saying, or asking rather, is there anything in crypto, like outside of maybe Bitcoin specifically, is there anything in crypto that you have seen and you've said, oh, that is really interesting? We've sort of talked about this with a little bit when we were talking about layer twos and scaling, but like, is there anything that you say, oh, I really wish Bitcoin had that?
Yeah.
Points.
Points. Points. Not really. Like I mean, I'm gonna go out and say it. Like, honestly, I am to a certain extent very much charmed by the idea of NFTs. And this is going to be a controversial fucking take. But like, I'm not in, like, I'm charmed by the idea because I think from a purely human perspective, collectibles, if you study the work of Nick Szabo, and people like that, collectibles are kind of like the cousin of money, right? And people have been, humans have been obsessed with collectibles since before there was money, really. And so it's only natural to me that the most novel, interesting, and revolutionary new form of digital money that came into existence, comes with a protocol, a sidecar for collectibles. And, this is not me vouching for any of the crap that's out there. The challenging thing with collectibles in this day and age is this very neurotic kind of ADHD type of internet culture where a meme is so ephemeral, it's so short lived that it almost lends itself a lot more to speculation than traditional collectibles. There's a certain time preference aspect where you can fall in love with. I think before you could fall in love with Pokemons and imagine like this is going to be a generational thing, and 10 years from now, people are still going. They're still, it's still going to be a thing. Whereas, the hottest, you just look at the bored apes, but like the hottest culture in terms of NFT collectibles can become practically irrelevant in the span of a couple of years. And so there's a good argument to be made that regardless of the fact that those are collectibles, they tend to be more, the market for them from this point on is going to be a lot more speculative than the market for collectible has ever been. It's kind of like it's a ACC thing almost, accelerate fucking collectibles. This is what's happening, and this is what's playing out. And I understand, there's a lot of arguments. There's a lot of reasons why people hate that. At the end of the day, I've spoken with people that are into this shit, and like you said, for a lot of them, but at that point in time, they vibe with the fucking thing. They vibe with the fucking image, the community. Like they feel like they're a part of something. Now, what does this say about the human conditions? Is there some kind of like very metaphilosophical kind of question where like we're looking for this sense of belonging in meme tokens? Maybe that's but to each his own, really. And so like from purely that perspective, and I know that's a bit of a cop out. I don't know if you were expecting me to like proclaim my adoration of Zcash or like
No.
something that I would really like to almost. I sometimes I find myself being like, am I really just too stupid that I cannot fall in love with zero knowledge proofs the way that everyone seems to be?
Yeah. No,
It's
I mean, I think that, yeah, like it's like the ultimate right curve nerd snipe. And the irony is like, I think I was actually talking to somebody about this. ZK Tech for us, I'm putting myself like in this category as well. It's like it is probably the biggest, if that I can think of. It is probably the biggest disconnect between the people who get it proclaiming it is going to change the world versus the rest of us. Like that gap, because, and I say this because like I look at AGI and like the people who understand AGI or like what AGI can potentially bring. Okay, we understand like, oh, okay, this could like solve every problem ever, right? Like no more scarcity. Like it dawns on us. But when I like hear people talk about ZK Tech, when I hear people talk about just how massive a breakthrough this is, I'm like, okay, I don't get it. Like I just like it just does not resonate. Like are we just compressing things? But like, it really has like truly captivated a lot of like the smartest people. So I'm not willing to make a statement on it. But yeah, I agree with that. Like it's really quite interesting. One glimmer of hope for us, I think, is like Shinobi, who is much more technical than I am, is like sort of maybe possibly on our side a little bit. He's like, I don't know yet exactly like where this plays out. I'm like, okay, all right, this is good for us.
yeah,
So yeah, that's interesting you say that.
yeah, and I mean, the way I look at it also is kind of like, because it is such a nerd snipe for this right curve people. I guess one of the reason why I kind of like tend to hold back is that my right curve oracles, although I know that they've been kind of like thinking about those kinds of things for years and perhaps longer than most people that are working on them now. They haven't gone out there in public and said like, you know what, like maybe ZK stuff is like the way forward. When you think about like the Polstras of this world, and they work with they've been doing research work for some of the most preeminent researchers in that field for years, and the fact that they haven't dropped everything they're doing to say like, we should focus on that, is like, okay, well, probably because A, it's not ready, or B, it's just, maybe it's magic and maybe it does a lot of stuff um, right, and in a much better way than anything else, any alternative. Um, but maybe we don't know how to use it properly, right? Because yeah, I mean, Jeremy Rubin I was telling him like, so what if we had I think I was asking him, what if you had a clean slate for like a layer two? How would you architecture that, regardless of like the trust model, and the trust assumptions that users of that layer two are making? And I think he said something to the extent of like, I'd look towards like a Carol type of language model where you can have everything just compressed, and it's so all very lightweight. So I'm like, yeah, okay, well, actually, maybe that makes a lot of sense, because definitely from the perspective of having the ZK on layer one, so that we can have um, those quote unquote trustless rollups. I know I don't. I mean, I see it. I see it playing out in Ethereum, and I don't like the way it's looking. Like it's just like it creates too much issues, and like there's just too much. Um, it's just not as simple as people are making it sound. It's like, oh, we're gonna have trustless. No, but like then like what are you gonna have? Like just like one single. I think Eric has like said that at one point. It's like, well, roll up kind of like only makes sense if you have like just one single massive roll up where everyone is into that one single massive roll up, right? Or it's like, okay, well then like that just makes the roll up trust assumption into the trust assumption of like the entire network. Um, so yeah, it's it feels like magic, and you're kind of like on the side be like, I don't really believe in magic. But
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of interesting too because like Eric often cites how Greg Maxwell was talking about ZK
mhm,
proofs, like
mhm.
in 2014 or
Yeah,
whatever,
yeah,
and like I don't think Greg Maxwell has only worked on ZK proofs since then. You know what I mean? So there's like a little bit of irony, but yeah, I mean, it actually does kind of bring up like another interesting question I wanted to ask you, which is like I think a lot on of you, like we were saying before, like if you kind of strip away a lot of the maybe the degeneracy and like some of the more like surface layer stuff, one point that maybe these like Bitcoin season 2 people have made is like a lot of this research, like a lot of this funding is happening in other ecosystems. And like I'm not talking so much about like the DeFi stuff right now. I'm talking about like more like ZK stuff. Like a lot of the ZK stuff is happening like on Ethereum and elsewhere. And I'm interested to hear like what do you think Bitcoin needs if we need it, right? Because like I think you make some interesting points. Like Bitcoin doesn't need to scale, right? Like so I think you kind of have an even keeled approach here, but like is there a way that we can bring these type of developers to Bitcoin? Because like as you know, like you more than anybody, and like you've obviously seen this play out, like the whole kind of crypto industrial complex like has this kind of unlock with tokens and like this the financing of this stuff. And I do wonder like do we have to resort to kind of like these degen games, or are there ways to bring people who are interested in that type of stuff to Bitcoin without saying like you can launch 30 meme coins every day, you know?
yeah. Well, I think part of it is happening right now through this, perhaps questionable method of, the taproot wizards and the ordinals, um, because it, I don't know if you'll remember, but and I should probably bring that up because I haven't really spoken publicly about it. But um, last year, at almost the same, or maybe a little later in the year, I came up with this Bitcoin script project thing where I had this idea of creating a resource platform for Bitcoin script and allowing more users and developers to become aware of some of the progress that had been made in terms of those primitives, whether it be covenants, whether it be kind of like wallet thing, like what's Rob Hamilton thing. Anyways, like the
Mini script.
mini script, exactly. So I was pretty enthusiastic about that because I think, and the feedback that I had gotten, which was that I had like identified, I think, a major pain point in the ecosystem, which is that the documentation in general was absolutely garbage. If you compared Bitcoin documentation to pick your ecosystem, Solana, Avalanche, Stacks, like, I mean, of course, they have foundations and VCs that are throwing millions of dollars at creating and marketing this developer ecosystem, and so they're putting together super neat stuff for people to get onboarded in whatever is their chain or their token. And I think it's happening right now through ordinals. I think like it's it's pretty crazy to me that it's so objectively true that so many more users of Bitcoin, the ones that are partaking in ordinals, have an affinity with UTXO control and like SIG hash flags and all of that stuff. Things that you would have never really like uh, hear about from except like devs in their caves, or people that are really really into their Bitcoin wallet and all of that, and so it's clear to me that this ecosystem, I think, has created already a lot of value in terms of having us on board developers. And it's easy to make the argument that well, okay, like, do we need like this, very demeaning, but like, do we need the script kiddies to be working on Bitcoin. Um, I think, you just, it's, I think ultimately you'll get a couple of good um, nuts out of that entire bag of weird shit, and those are going to, like, I don't want to say that Reindl has, he was there a little before Ordinals, but I think he really came into his own at the same time, and I think he's turning into such a major, valuable contributor, regardless of the fact, that he works at Taproot, or maybe actually, as far as I'm concerned, I think he's empowered by Taproot Wizards, and for him to be able to do the work that he's doing right now in terms of researching Upcat and working on it, like, that's, at the end of the day, it's like, um, I think Taproot Wizards is the best example of that. Is like, people have been extremely critical of them raising money and whatever, and selling NFTs, um, but they're they're factually using that money to fund valuable Bitcoin research in the same way that the Blockstream was. Now, I don't want to compare their achievements, but Udi was on Twitter the other day saying, okay, well, since everyone's having like a hard on about like CISA, this cross input signature aggregation,
Yeah.
I propose that at least one of you stand up and commits to doing work on it and implementing it or researching it and whatever. And I have a budget for you. And you know, people will dismiss that and think he's just like full of shit. But I am pretty convinced that he is being honest, and he's being uh, like, he actually would be willing to contribute
Yeah.
to
Definitely.
funds to that 100%. And so how do we? And so aside from that, like, putting that aside, I think generally the way that we do that is that we approach this from a second layer perspective, right? Or like a financial Bitcoin infrastructure perspective, where it's like, you don't have to, it's like, you can have the best documentation in the world. A lot of people that are not so familiar with Bitcoin will look at what you have and what you can do on chain and be like, well, you can't do anything. Like, I cannot build anything that way. But I think one of the important narrative shift that's happening, and I think I'm taking the complete opposite stance of Craig Raw here, which is that it's important that we acknowledge that there is a like trust models that can satisfy specific use case, and that we don't treat that as some kind of anti-Bitcoin operation, or um, unholy, or whatever that is. Because this is where people can actually build stuff. Is, you'll tell them, well, I have users that are fine with trusting this multisig. I have this federation, say this, we have this Fedimint infrastructure. There's a consensus model. Take that and run with it and build whatever you want. You can build literally, like, pick your programming language almost. Obviously there's going to be some work to be done as far as like what seems to be the best option, but there's a lot more uh, surface for experimentation there that those kinds of developers are going to be interested in. So I think this is the way we approach that. And so from that perspective, if I can kind of like circle back to Bitcoin season 2 and all of those layer twos, the one thing that I've said that I think is valuable, regardless of some of the technical question marks that are around the proposed protocols, is the social um, graphs that are happening at the financial level, where there are actually sort of intentions to create federations, right? They have different names for them or whatever, like, but like, I think the more we learn about um, how different businesses can come together to offer services and what makes sense, it's going to be like, like Fedimint. The moment that the creation of those federated mint is kind of uh, let loose in the sense that it's available through a simple UX, it's going to be like there's going to be disasters. People are going to create all kinds of federations. Stupid people are going to put their money in them, and stupid people are going to lose their money. But we need to start to iterate there fast. I was always of the opinion that like I like fundamentally the liquid and the architecture. I think it's like it's a trust model that, yes, it's trusted, but you can define the outline of trust. You can pick who you're trusting, and you can work from there. But clearly, I think that for different reason, the market chose not to adopt it. Um, but in different circumstances, I think we need. I've tweeted we need more bankers. Really, we need more people to step to the plate and be like, do some regulatory arbitrage and say, like, we're going to create this federation and we don't have problems serving US users. Um, and if they provide, a good enough service, maybe they'll be able to fight, US regulators the same way that all the shitcoiners are fighting US regulators, right? This is the point I was making, is like, um, Bitcoiners have taken this attitude of like asking permission almost, right? Where like it's the degens and the shitcoiners that are like, well, fuck asking permission. We'll just ask forgiveness if it comes. And for the most part, they've been right. They've been slapped on the wrist.
Yeah.
So it's not my intention also to get people, users, protocol creators to expose themselves to legal liabilities. I understand there's a real risk there. Um, but like I said, I think this attitude of this cypherpunk attitude of this Mircea Popescu attitude of Bitcoin is sovereign, and like you want to like send me letters, but like as long as I'm relatively out of your purview, or I mean, obviously the US has pretty long arms, but I would like for people to do what the Madeira Federation has done. I don't know what the Madeira Ferdinand Federation, what kind of like regulation they fall into, because arguably they're a money transmitter, but they're in this like, I know that Madeira has kind of like some perhaps Bitcoin affinity going on at the state level in Portugal. So if or some people in El Salvador could be playing that game. Um, so I'd like very much for more of those um, experiments to happen, and so that's why I'm like, okay, well, you guys want to create more multisig? Fine with it, go ahead. I think we'll learn a lot from it, even if the underlying protocol is perhaps questionable.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I asked you, but then we kind of got sidetracked. But you were long. You have long been a
Yeah.
outspoken critic of Ethereum. You okay? So like, I highly recommend listeners go and listen to your podcast on Stefan Livera. I think you've only ever done two. I recommend listening to both of them. Um,
The first one would have
a
been the one
lot.
about
Okay.
the first one.
So you
Yeah,
talked.
sorry.
Yeah, you talked a lot about Ethereum. Ethereum's moving to proof of stake. I think that almost, I'll grade you. I think almost all of your predictions have come into fruition or are very close to coming into fruition. You made a lot of points about just proof of stake centralizing, your thoughts on liquid staking derivatives. This is coming up like right as we speak right now, like with regards to kind of like messing with the issuance curve potentially. But yeah, like I'm interested to hear what your, I don't know if you have updated thoughts. I mean, I probably not like anything um, more optimistic, but yeah, like what are you seeing in Ethereum that is interesting or you want to go off about the exciting parts?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing that I think it hasn't quite played out like I predicted, or maybe it's just too early, um, is the notion of this um, this capture of uh, like the capture of MEV has been relatively mild, from the perspective of trying to pull off things that might seem not in the interest of users. At the time, there was a lot of people, talking about doing like multi-block stuff and almost kind of like reorgs and um, and the notion. I think I was I think the notion that, for example, someone like Lido would be extremely predatory in terms of trying to generate or capture as much MEV as possible has not happened because I think of purely social conventions, really. Um, and so, you know, Lido perhaps has not mustered as much of the staking as the stake ETH as I thought it would have by now. They're still at 30%, which is still pretty major. Um, but I think, yeah, the most interesting thing is this exact problem, I think, of predatory MEV and sort of very PvP on chain against between stakers is exactly what they're worried about now, right? Because um, the notion that they're discussing of there being increasingly large amount of Ethereum being staked and thereby reducing the actual reward, right, for stakers, creates this scenario where if you have 100% of the ETH that's staked, well, all of the revenues from staker has to come from, MEV types of activities and all of that, right? And so when you have no more, um, when no one actually benefits from the inflation um, or the new issuance because everyone gets the same, well, the only thing you're left to do is actually look for revenues elsewhere. And I think at that point, it becomes a lot more, like the social convention kind of like fall apart and everyone's like, it's like kind of like to each his own, not to each his own, but like every man for himself, really. Um, and it's funny I mean, and I'm not going to say that I envisioned exactly this from this perspective, but um, I did remember pointing out at the time that would have been 3 years ago now, like what happens if it's 100%? Like it seems like a lot of the assumptions and the work that had been done in terms of the security model were done with the case being that there would be, I don't know, 25, 30, 40%, 50%. Um, and so, yeah, this is kind of like creating this clash, I think, over in Ethereum because the tendency that they have whenever a problem like that creep up is to just um, turn a knob here and there, and then maybe like create a protocol on top or whatever. Here in this case, they're obviously talking about like um, messing with the issuance rate, and I think the conversation might have gone differently at a different point in time. I think they would have been able to kind of like um, almost kind of like omnibus that shit at one point if Ethereum was, you know, almighty and like if they had realized this during the last full cycle and being, oh, that's going to be a problem, they might have been able to like flip the switch on that without too many people um, complaining about it. But I think they find themselves in a very tough situation at the moment. with obviously the conversation around Solana, the fact that their roll up roadmap is getting more complex by the day, um, the fact that it's all just like, they've just doubled down. Like I tweeted that just earlier, but like I think this cycle they didn't find really anything novel. They just doubled down on Ponzi's, and you're seeing that with all of the derivatives and the points system. It's kind of bewildering that no one's calling their bluff in terms of like what points are. Was Frentech the first one to come up with it? They were, right. It was like keys like they were calling them
Um,
keys at first, and then I was like, oh well, actually maybe we'll call them points now.
Yeah. I think no. Okay, so I think that originally Frentech the points were called share or okay, so the actual ownership was called shares, but you got points. They changed it from shares to keys. You still get points. So the points are still out there and seemingly increasing by the day. So yeah, I mean you're spot on. Like it does seem that there's just like an ever increasing number of different ways to frame these kind of Ponzi games. I think um, one thing with regards to the proof of stake, I think okay, this is like, well, I don't know, this is like so revelatory, but I think that they did not. I say they, like the people who designed Ethereum proof of stake. I don't think they fully envisioned restaking to the extent. And so, like, maybe not just specifically restaking, but more just the desire to earn outsized yield once a lot of people stake. You're not, it's beta. You know what I mean? So people will always push out on the risk curve. And I think my intuition, and like I said, this is nothing revelatory, like other people have said this, but I think that they didn't entirely see that if you create something with yield, but then everybody starts getting the yield, that people are going to want more yield in order to hold that. And I believe that is like, so the reason I say this is because there was a Bankless episode, I don't know, maybe like a year ago where there was this like discussion about restaking alignment, and it seemed like it kind of came out of the blue a little bit, like, oh, like this restaking thing is going to be big. And when you kind of have this pseudo inflationary system like that is like that in perpetuity, you are going to have people who realize, oh, okay, like the yield I'm receiving is really just maintaining my purchasing power when enough people are staking. So I'm going to have to push out further on the risk curve. I think this is sort of what has, yeah, I think this is like one of these things that they didn't like fully see the scope of. And it's also the other thing I would say about this is like the restaking, because I made the point like a lot of the Ethereum staking derivatives and whatnot were already existed in the protocol. Like there were applications that controlled a lot of ETH, right? Like Lido was one, Maker, Aave. Like there was already locking up of ETH in like large amounts. But what happened with the restaking was it extended this to like now securing these other chains. And like, okay, what happens if these chains get really big? And so I think that was sort of what pushed this out. But yeah, I mean, I'm mainly I'm mainly in agreement with what we're seeing. Like,
I think they
I
assumed.
follow.
Sorry, I think I think they knew. They kind of knew. They knew to a certain extent that I think all of that stuff, perhaps. Well, I don't know about the restaking, but they they knew about the degeneracy of the people they were building for. I think they assumed too much alignment, right? The mistake that they did was assuming that too many people were that more people would be running like solo staking nodes, that more people would not trust, for example, the security risk of those types of contracts and be like, oh, you know what, I'm safer, I'm happy with my yield, and I'm just going
Right.
whereas like no, actually like there are plenty content chasing the yield on the risk curve because there's no culture of there's very little culture of security consciousness, and kind of like, and then this whole alignment thing, it goes out the window the moment that the profit incentive becomes big enough, really.
Yeah. So what are like do you have any predictions about Ethereum? Because like you've been long you don't have to give like precise predictions obviously, but like you've been a long time critic and like pretty consistent on your criticisms. And I'm just curious, like, I follow this stuff. Like I'm sort of much more in that sphere than you are, obviously. Like I follow this. I'm like friends with a lot of these people. Like I really like a lot of these people. And I'm just curious, like if you have any like hot takes regarding like the long term viability of, I don't know, Ethereum or maybe just crypto as a whole. Like,
Yeah,
do we just keep going?
I think it keeps going. I mean, I've been saying for a long time that those are kind of, it's an industry that it's just like validator as a service, in the same way that like it's part, ultimately maybe they're really all like Bitcoin side chains. In the sense that there are specific distributed technologies that allow for financial instruments to exist, financial exchange to exist. Um, the big question mark is the economics of it, right? Is like, can you sustain the price required um, for the Ethereum asset to justify people contributing this security through staking? I think that is the massive question mark, and um, it's going to play out to a certain extent in the same way that I think competition between uh, tech companies would play out, but it has a network effect aspect to it with a lot of sunk costs. So it's go, people are going to go to very large extreme, I think, to ultimately preserve the value of their asset. But all of that shit just collapses to zero, really. Like payments, we know that payments, like this is like there's practically zero margins to be had from offering payments. And I certainly don't buy the notion that like Kyle Samani was saying, that the business model of Ethereum validators, no, sorry, of Solana validators, um, is basically to chase MEV, right?
Yeah, yeah,
It's basically saying that like the incentive model for Solana is screwing up, or like basically scamming users. Front running users and extracting value. I know that there are like quote unquote good forms of MEV, but that's beside the point. So it's hard for me. I think they're all competing for second place from the crypto like blockchain perspective, and it's not going to collapse. I've been saying for a while, it's not going to blow up in a giant ball of flames, because they do have this culture of social consensus, right? And with social consensus, you can always fix everything. You'll just ostracize a certain portion of users, but it doesn't matter. They're very much that community is very much willing to make those sacrifices, and so they'll patch it up as they go. They'll try to make it like a competitive option on the market, but I don't know anyone that's well, actually, I was going to say I don't know anyone that's building like Bitcoin coupled with Ethereum product. I guess that's what the Bob thing is.
yeah,
Um, but I find myself having a lot more conversation with some Bitcoin developers that are like, okay, well, if we need some kind of like sidecar uh, thing for, you know, like a stable coin, for example, we'll just use Solana for right.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
I think we have like a mutual friend,
yeah,
Shazan. He's doing
exactly.
something like really. He's doing something actually quite cool, and actually it goes to kind of your point with regards to DLC. Is like the trust model there is better than the overwhelming majority of like lending pools, right?
Oh
Because
yeah,
it is isolated.
yeah, yeah.
Now, the one thing that I think the one thing about like, so just a little bit of context, people aren't going to know what we're talking about, but there's this product called Lava that I don't know when they're going to ship. They don't have a token, so just if you're listening for that reason, you can go ahead and stop. But it's like it uses discrete log contracts, and you basically can put Bitcoin in, and on the other end, permissionlessly, you can borrow against it, and the it uses I honestly would have to have him explain it to me again, but it uses a Solana USDC backend, so you can borrow against it. It's very private. The one thing that is different about this is you can't have like these like loans in perpetuity. That's one thing that it's like fixed. So it's like fixed term loans. But yeah, like you're right. Like this is an example of, these things can be built on Bitcoin. There hasn't been a tremendous amount of demand for them. I think we will see more demand for this type of stuff. But yeah, like he told me the same thing. He's like, look, like we're using the Solana code. I think it's really good. It like there's a lot of optimizations that he could do around it that he said is really good. And yeah, it is interesting to me, and it also kind of goes to show what I heard you've talked about like a long time ago, which is like this stuff can be viewed as tech, right? Like and it's not to say that Bitcoin isn't tech, but like Bitcoin has some very specific properties. Some people would argue that those are, you know, changeable, but for the most part, like Bitcoin has this kind of like monetary property first and foremost. And then a lot of the rest of this stuff is like, it kind of needs to constantly innovate, right? Constantly keep up with the technical demand. And like, I think, like this is sort of the inconvenient truth that we're seeing with regards to Solana, or maybe it's not inconvenient, but like it's just a truth we are seeing with Solana, which is like Solana is much, much better for degenerate gambling. It just is. It's all on, it's very cheap. It's hard to land transactions, I'll tell you that. Like they very rarely get on chain because like it's spammed constantly, but it's just much better for this. And this is where we've seen this crop up. And like, I was talking to somebody earlier today about this. And like, I don't know that the question resonated like so well, but I do wonder if we just kind of like continuously move on the tech spectrum and maybe even we find something interesting, like if we keep going, like making it faster, making these better. You and I would probably agree. Like, I don't know how much of this exactly needs a blockchain. Um, there's a lot of things. There's a lot of things that can be done in a permissionless way that don't require a blockchain. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, Lightning is the easiest example probably for Bitcoiners to understand. It's just a protocol. It's a graph of multi-sigs, and you don't need another blockchain. And like this kind of goes back to our point with regards to rollups, like and why we were talking about like whether or not Udi and Eric really want rollups. Like I'm sort of unsold on the model, so yeah, like it is quite
Yeah,
interesting.
when you look at what you're trying to achieve, really, and if you accept the premise that those constructs are desirable, say the AMMs or the lending pools and all of that, then you're really looking for maximum efficiency and execution speed and all of that, and perhaps less so, security, censorship resistance, decentralization, and from that perspective, and perhaps you want to make it private, also. So there's less of those opportunities. You have like, I think there's, they are like, there are like, you were asking me the question if was anything in crypto that I particularly like. There's nothing that makes me like go like, wow, like I absolutely want it. But I know that there are like constructs for kind of like blind mempools and things like that are like you kind of like, oh, this is interesting, and we can totally have that in a different trust setting with Bitcoin, and again, it's all about. I don't think it's not all about everyone using the same service provider in the sense that this service provider is a quote unquote neutral protocol, because right, this is kind of like the hypocrisy almost that we're seeing with things like Aave and all of that. It's kind of like, okay, well, you have this neutral open protocol, but really there are people that are telling you like what kind of like pool is safe and not, and like what kind of asset you can put in that pool. And obviously they're saying it's all decentralized governance and all of that, but we all know it's bullshit. So it's like, okay, well, if we don't have if we're not able to build this fully decentralized protocol for financial service, actually, I mean, I know I'm kind of like repeating what we were saying in the beginning, but you just use whatever tech is best, and you choose whatever whatever trust model you're most comfortable with, who you're feeling that you can trust to a certain extent, and you choose to operate with them. And a lot of the operation will actually be very much trust minimized, so that you know exactly what. And I think this is what ultimately creates value, and what steals value out of all of those systems is the complexity makes it impossible to mentally calculate the hidden cost of you participating in those systems. And so
Yeah.
if you remove that, then I think the market becomes much more informed, transparent, and therefore more effective at doing
Yeah.
exactly what it's trying to achieve.
Yeah. I think like, yeah, I would certainly agree. And I think that one of my objections largely to the idea and like why you kind of say like decentralized money and permissionless finance is because, and I'm like sort of in the same vein in that sense, is because I think that a lot of the like these protocols that are attempting to create like these decentralized financial products, there's something a little bit unique about finance that's different than like hopefully a distributed commodity money or whatever you want to call Bitcoin. And it's that these systems require a lot of liquidity. Like they require centralization of liquidity. So I think a lot of times what you hear is like, well, you can fork Aave, you can fork Uniswap, but you can't really do that. That's actually not really feasible in practice, right? Like you can, but if you're the only liquidity provider, what are you going to do? Borrow against yourself? So you do need like this kind of like centralization of capital. And I think this is sort of like the realization, I don't know, that I had. I don't know if I ever had like a strong opinion prior, but like this is something that I think is a little bit off about like with these DeFi is like you can like fork the last version of a DeFi protocol to yourself, but like all of the market makers, all of the big, yeah, like these MEV shops, like they're all going to go to the best tech, which is the newest tech, which is the one that's like has, like the DAO token has control over or whatever. And then when you start thinking about it like that, you kind of like zoom out. It's like, I don't really even know if it's like, I don't know that writing open source software is like the most critical part of what's going on. It's almost like seems like not a very, it seems like a small part of what's actually occurring in practice. Like in terms of like the importance of these different parts of the system. So yeah, I've
Yeah,
had similar thoughts and like,
it's kind of
yeah, I think you're right.
it's kind of clashing, right? It's like, because we have this open source infrastructure, but it kind of like we're like a lot of people are working under the pretense that specialization is not a thing, right? And
Right.
that we haven't been working with specialization as long as like markets have existed. And so there's economies of scale with finance. Obviously, this
Right.
is why bankers are bankers, because they're actually, historically, the and people have this corrupted idea, which maybe contributes to this notion that, oh, we need to remove human agency as much as possible. But that's not really the case. It's like bankers are bankers because they are good at managing money, and like investing money and lending money and making the right decisions. And you cannot replace, at least not yet, you cannot replace that with protocols. It's already, it's creeping into, it's creeped into every single protocol that's been designed. Is like, okay, well, what are the parameters of like this landing pool and whatever, and it's a human making this decision.
Right. Exactly.
So
It's the VCs with all the DAO tokens. That's who makes them, you
exactly,
know?
exactly. So
Yeah.
it's like, well, let's not try to like confuse and obfuscate the fact that there are still people that are most well advised to create financial products because they're professionals. I'm not saying, there's certain special class or whatever, but it is the case that there's some fucking people that are smarter than others and that have more acumen with business management and banking and whatever. And so let those people uh, do the work and let me interface with them via some technology that allows me to minimize the trust. I don't want to go to like an open market where it's like, I don't know who my financial service provider is, it's just random. I want to go to like a market of financial providers that are rated according to specific, web of trust or whatever kind of like schemes with reputation base. And it's like, okay, well, those guys, are working that way. This is the trust model, and those are the services that they offer. So,
Yeah.
I don't want to say that they have people in ETH or whatever have it all wrong, because I shared I think they're kind of working towards that with the idea of like, I think they're doing like those vaults thing, right, where it's like um there's this new lending protocol that's kind of like exactly this, where you have
Yeah.
isolated lending pools, and
Yes.
the lending pools are very specifically managed by, I think, this Gauntlet entity, right? Those quants or whatever.
Yeah.
Uh,
Morpho.
yeah,
Yeah.
more.
It's
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
and it like takes into account like the actual collateral used, right? And like the
exactly.
term of the collateral.
So
Yeah.
the idea being that, like, if you're a lender and you want to put your money to work, um, you don't put it into some kind of landing pool on Aave, and all of a sudden some retard creates this some retard creates this landing pool that creates like a huge bad debt, like systemic risk almost to the entire protocol, and you end up getting fucked over because what was the token
Yeah.
during the bear market that had
Curve.
like Curve? Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
it's like, why do I want to create liability for myself by participating into a protocol where the consequence of the actions of others are going to impact me, even though I'm not doing business with them. I have nothing to do with them.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah.
it seems to be a much more elegant system, and I think we should like be I think at least if we circle back to Bitcoin again, if we want to be inspired to a certain extent by what um, those people are building, or what's been built in Ethereum or whatever. It's like, I think Udi was making that same point with regards to MEV and all of that. It's like, well, we kind of know like where it went wrong with Ethereum. So like,
Yeah.
why is everyone assuming that we're just going to do the same exact mistakes, right? You never know, because there's just too much funny money running around, and no one can like validate. I can only imagine the conversations that are happening with VCs and people trying to do layer two on Bitcoin right now. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah. So
I want to I want to ask you one last question. This is totally out of order, but I just thought about this because I wanted to tap into your kind of like your history of Bitcoin, but also your even keeledness. So this, I'm borrowing two of your attributes here to ask this question. There's been, because I wasn't, the reason I asked is because I was not around for this at all. So I wanted to hear your perspective. There's been a lot of talk about how, and I'm using this word specifically here, how Lightning was marketed early on. And I know that like Lightning Labs raised a lot of money. Who is the other? There's like a few companies that raised a lot of money on the Lightning premise. And I'm curious, like, because this is something that I would only know from asking somebody who was around at the time. Like, did you think that Lightning was marketed as this like end all be all solution, and that like so we now know its limitations, right? Like you've now discussed that, but like I'm curious because like you hear this a lot, like from especially from like Stefan Rivera tweeted like something about this recently, but then Udi and Eric have been like obviously very very strong about how much of a failure Lightning's been,
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
was just curious. What is your view now looking back? Like, was Lightning marketed as this saving grace and just we should be calling it a failure because of how much it was marketed? Or is this a little bit overkill? I'm just
Yeah,
curious.
yeah. I mean, it was definitely it was definitely marketed as the solution for payments, for cheap payments using Bitcoin,
Okay.
with
Yeah.
very little consideration. Although, as I pointed out earlier, the creators of the protocol um, included in the original paper, as far as I know, and even had um, presentation at conference illustrating. I think they called it the Dryja, Taj Dryja, who's not Lightspark,
Yeah.
the Dryja bathtub thing or whatever. And they kind of had modeled the block size with how much people would be able to be onboarded onto Lightning. And they kind of were very, very, very aware that there was there was pretty severe limitations if you were to remain with the like I mean at the time it was 1 megabyte and now it's
Yeah.
effectively four at most. And but the one thing that was I think most um I don't want to say misleading because it was not some kind of conspiracy. It was everyone bought into this idea, and I will tell you who was right about Lightning was a lot of B cashers. Uh,
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
a lot of them, I think, probably because of the situation, looked at it with more scrutiny. And the one thing that they said would play out was that it was going to be a hub and spoke system, and that no one would ever want or be financially incentivized to run their own Lightning nodes, right? And
Yeah.
I remember probably myself getting into arguments with some of those people, and I don't remember quite like what my arguments were, but like certainly there was certainly there was this narrative from us maxis or whatever. It was like no, it's all fine. We'll figure it out, and it's going to be absolutely brilliant. Everyone's going to be peer to peer, running their own nodes in their Lightning wallet. But yeah, very little consideration for the problems of liquidity and all of that. And I mean, moving that, so yeah, the expectations were set all wrong. And that I think the problem also is that this is something that this illusion lasted for a long time, because you said Lightning Labs raised a lot of money and all of that. Well, actually, as I mentioned earlier, the entire, you know, call it like the entire first round, first iteration of Bitcoin venture capital. I remember like distinctly
Yeah.
when it became a thing, and people were like, "Oh, we're going to do Bitcoin VC as well." The entire, I mean, practically like probably 90% of the money that went into those funds went into Lightning companies with zero consideration for the problems that we're facing now. I don't want to say zero. Some smart people here and there, I'm sure they had concern, but I'm sure they also thought that like the fee issue wouldn't rear its head as soon as early um, as it did. Um, but yeah, moving forward to now, from that perspective, I think of Lightning being a reliable payment solution for end users under the model um, it was proposed, and under the model that the industry operated in for the last it's almost been 10 years now. I think Lightning, it's a failure. But we also we also, I mean, Lightning works also, and it works very well for a very specific use case in terms of like
Yeah.
having this ability to do instant settlement at high velocity. It's actually pretty fucking brilliant, and the infrastructure
Yeah,
is
it is. It's funny
it's
you say that because like especially yeah, like sorry to interrupt, but like this is I never had this view coming in like so I'm like later, right? And so I never had this view like whether or not Bitcoin was or sorry, Lightning was going to save us. So I see how Lightning is constructed and I compare that to like some of the layer 2s elsewhere and I'm like, "Oh, this is like kind of brilliant." It's like Tor. It's like Tor, but you just zap stuff around and it it's like it can be very private. I don't know, like I have a Lightning wallet, I never use it, but I don't know how privately I'm using it. But yeah, like I see like, oh, it's a routing network, right? And it doesn't require a blockchain. It doesn't require this like rich statefulness that you need with all of these like consensus mechanisms and whatnot. And I'm like, this is a really good idea.
yeah.
And it's funny, like I talked to a kid recently who he works at like Celestia, which is like another, blockchain. And he's like very big on payments. And he was saying the same thing. He's like these channels are like extremely elegant solutions. It's just that they don't really work. And so like, like, but in
they
terms of like a lot of the,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, they sorry, I mean, yeah, they work. They work, but they were envisioned, I think the mistake, the failure really is the assumption of a peer-to-peer topology, right?
yeah,
Whereas we would just, have our own node and again find like route payments all over. But I think there's still the opportunity, and this is what's happening now, and where it's like, okay, that peer-to-peer topology doesn't make any sense at all. We're just going to work under the Lightning Service Provider model, and so we're going to
yeah,
have a lot of people connect to the same provider, and money will be routed through different providers, and hopefully we get as much competition as possible between those service providers. Hopefully some people are running their own infrastructure if we make it as easy as possible, and then it is actually very effective. I think I wonder how, I think like maybe even like, because yeah, so the one thing that the light bulb that moment that I had today when I saw the light spark moment is actually made. Was I wrong about Tether or USDC on Lightning? Am I
yeah.
am
I
I
can
mid
tell
am I
you,
am I mid curving this right now? Because I've always thought like, and a lot, this is what everyone is repeating. But it's like, oh, this is over architecture for Lightning. It doesn't make any fucking sense at all. No one's gonna want to use it because Lightning doesn't work anyways. But then it's like, okay, Coinbase, Lightspark, Circle. Now you have Lightning available on Binance, OKX, all the major
yeah,
exchanges, Bitfinex. Well, then it's like, actually, if you're some kind of market maker, maybe it's actually starting to make sense for you to manage your inventory via Lightning in between like all kinds of different venues.
yeah.
And you can do that. I mean, obviously, you can do that with Bitcoin, but you can also probably do that with USDC if Lightspark and Coinbase, start playing that game.
No, I can tell you like for certain that there's actually some things that you may find kind of interesting that are coming. Yeah, I mean, I think like we were talking about Mark Goodwin at Bitcoin Magazine. Like he's like very anti stablecoin, and I think it's like good to have those voices, right? Because like one thing that I think, like I live in the first world, you live in the first world. Like I think we are kind of like we're privileged that we can be like, yeah, I want to hold Bitcoin. Like I don't find the value of like stable coins, right? Like it's just not that interesting to me. It's just not like, and this is what is. I mean, a lot of the rest of crypto is kind of like predicated on this idea that like these are great rails for stable coins. And I'm like, guys, like, come on, like, what are we doing here? Right. Like, it's just not that interesting. But like there's clearly demand. And I think that yeah, I think that Lightning can like with these like taproot assets, these can be like put on Lightning. And I think there's like a lot of potential there. I won't personally use them. I'll hold Bitcoin and stick to Bitcoin. But yeah, I think like it definitely we may see something like this like coming soon.
Yeah, I mean, there's a push for it. There's a lot of companies that are trying to make this a thing. It's a challenge, from a UX perspective, because like it's hard to beat Tron for where's the demand? You ask, where's the demand for stable coins at the more retail level, and those places, they're just like they're perfectly fine with trusting something like the Tron
Yeah.
blockchain. But can you? So yeah, it's like, can you architecture that via Lightning in a way that the UX is good? You can probably do it, but in the end, you end up with a very, I think, almost custodial-ish Lightning, right? Where it's like,
Yeah.
then at this point, it's like, okay, well, then why are you really, does it need to be on Lightning? Um, yeah, but I think it's huge. Like this Coinbase and Lightning news. Yeah, like I said, I think we peak bearishness, and with the Phoenix wallet, Phoenix server, um, the numbers are not too bad actually. If you look at it, because the point that's been made is just like, oh, it's obnoxiously expensive using Lightning actually when you're doing high fee events or whatever. But with the right providers, I think they can make it so that it's probably remains true with the limitations that we have. But at least for near term, it might actually work good enough, right? So we'll see.
Yeah. Well, Alex, we've talked for a really long time. I may split this into 2 episodes. But this was awesome. It's really great to talk to somebody who's just been in this for a while and has seen all of it. Like, I think that's very yeah, not to go off on another tangent, but I do think that's like very, very valuable to have people who have been here since like 2013. It's not to say that like other people I talked to haven't, but like, you just get a lot of people in crypto now, I think, who've last cycle or the cycle before that entrance. And like, there are reasons that we've chosen to do things the way we have, and I think that
Yeah,
like sometimes it's sobering to talk to people who've been here and like, hey, like we have talked about this before, right? We've been through all of this. So yeah,
I,
I
I
really
think
do appreciate you.
I think in a way, like the thing that I think the reason why I find myself in this situation, fortunately or not, is that there's a lot of people that are still around that have been around for probably as long as I have. But in a lot of cases, they might be developers that have been working, for example, on Lightning for the last 10 years. And that's all really that they could afford to care about, right? Where I was fortunate enough to be around for that long and never really having to like, you could say I'm like the jack of all trades, kind of master of none type of persona. But you need that kind of. I agree. I mean, there's a handful of people like that in the Bitcoin ecosystem. Thinking about Aaron also. Anyway, there's someone at Bitcoin Magazine. Uh, well, anyways, so anyway, like encyclopedic minds like David at Bitcoin Optic, like people that just have consumed so much Bitcoin knowledge over the years
Yeah.
that they can easily kind of like reference things and maybe tell you if something's a good or bad idea without you spending too much time or wasting too much time on stuff. But
Yeah.
yeah, rambling at this point. It was a good one.
Well, thank you.
It was a good one. I appreciate the conversation, and yeah, I'm happy to get back on anytime if we
Awesome.
have.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we'll definitely do that. Thanks again, Alex.
All right, cheers.